is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you everybody who's here today. It's really a pleasure to spend this time with you. And as part of our launch of this new Drawdown Capital Coalition program and our Business Coalition program and these briefings. In the last briefing we did about a week ago, Dr. Kate Marvel gave a really outstanding presentation about the problems of climate change through the lens of the U.S. National Climate Assessment. How is the climate changing across the U.S.? What's happening in terms of natural resources, extreme weather events, and the human toll of climate change that we're seeing already in North America. That was kind of the problem of climate change. And future briefings are going to talk about very, very specific solutions to the issues of climate change as we go out into the future months. But right now, today, we're going to talk about the Drawdown Roadmap, basically a framework that helps us think through solutions and find ways of investing in the ones that are really the most effective and the most helpful. So I'm going to share a little presentation with you today about this roadmap, and then later have some time for questions, and really looking forward to the conversation. So let me share a few slides with you all today here first. Okay, here we go. Excellent. Well, at Project Drawdown, we are firmly convinced that we can still avoid climate change, the very worst aspects of climate change, and build a better future. Yes, the impacts of climate change are here today, but we still have a choice to make. Are they going to get a lot worse, getting to the worst ends of the spectrum of climate change impacts? Or do we deploy climate solutions and avoid that terrible stuff and build a better world? Well, we definitely believe that a better world is possible. But to do so, we're going to have to do a number of different things. And one of those things is we're going to have to pay very careful attention to the science and let science guide us on our journey towards climate solutions and towards that better future. Why should we pay attention to science? Well, because it's helped us a lot in the past. In fact, when it comes to climate change, science first told us about the problem in the first place. If it weren't for science, we'd have no idea why the planet seems to be warming up and weather patterns starting to get stranger and stranger. We would have no idea that, one, it was even happening at all, and second, why it was happening. But it was thanks to science that we understand the physics of our atmosphere and how greenhouse gases trap heat in the lower atmosphere, warming this planet, destabilizing weather patterns, and so on. So science has been critical in helping us understand this very complex planet and really giving us the tools to harness the future. So not only can science help us identify the problem, it can also help us sort out solutions. And wow, this is absolutely necessary today because it seems everybody and their brother is trying to sell us their favorite climate solution. There's money to be made here. There's fame. There's a lot of attention. And so everybody, whether they know anything about it or not, is telling the world what they think the best solutions to climate change might be. Go on any social media platform, go on Facebook, go on Twitter, just ask anybody, how do we stop climate change? And you'll be presented with a whole range of very strong, but maybe not very well-informed opinions about this. But that's not how we should move forward. We can't just listen to the people who shout the loudest to leave the fate of the world to them. We have to kind of avoid that and avoid the hype and the vitriol and the greenwashing that might accompany that, and use science to kind of sort out all of this noise to get us back on track. So one way to do that is to follow what we call the Drawdown Roadmap. It's a framework that can help us kind of sort out what to do, when to do it, where to do it, and what the benefits of that action might be in the future. So let's first talk about what we need to do. Well, when I think about solving the climate crisis, I sometimes think about chess. In the chess, we often hear the phrase, see the whole board, kind of look at the entire state of the game, from the opening gambit all the way to checkmate. And in chess, we have to learn how to operate multiple pieces across multiple parts of the board and multiple points of the game. Same thing with climate change. And let me extend that metaphor of a chessboard a little bit further. When we think about addressing climate change, it's very helpful to think about the suite of solutions that actually can change the atmosphere. Now, at Project Drawdown, we use the word solution with a very precise meaning. A solution is a physical thing. It's a practice, it's a technology that actually materially changes greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by either cutting the emissions, the crap that we put into the sky, or removing carbon from the sky and taking it out again. So it's either affecting the sources or the sinks of greenhouse gases going into and out of the atmosphere, but it's a physical thing that you can measure. So, like a carbon tax or policy or a protest, that's not a solution. Instead, what we call that is a lever. Levers are things that put solutions into motion. There are things like changing policy, investing capital in philanthropy and private capital, investing whatever. It's changing business behavior, individual behavior, doing tech investing, and so on. So we have solutions on one side of the board, the things that the atmosphere feels, and then we have levers that make them scale into the world and into the future. And together, that is the kind of chessboard in which we're going to be playing this game. So let's just set out to keep that in mind. We have levers and solutions, and we're going to need a lot of both of them. And we're going to have to learn how to play this entire board. But when it comes to solutions, how do we find out which ones work best? Well, this is kind of the hallmark of Drawdown's previous work, because we've done a lot of research on looking at hundreds and hundreds of different climate solutions and asking which ones work and which ones are scalable and what would they cost. And we put together a Drawdown Solutions library, which you can find on our website. It's at drawdown.org/solutions, and you can learn all about these. And we have a whole library of solutions, whether they're in electricity, things like energy efficiency or renewable energy sources, things that kind of use less electricity or produce it without carbon. We have solutions in the food sector and in transportation and across the whole suite of areas we need to work. And what we've done here is provide a rigorous evidence base for what solutions are actually effective and scalable that can make a difference in addressing climate change. Right now, there are about 100 solutions in that library. There are quite a few more that we did not include that didn't make the cut, and that's equally important. So we don't invest in solutions that really just don't make sense. So that's one good resource to kind of look at, and there are others that use a rigorous evidence base to decide what makes sense. Just like you would in medicine, before you take a drug or before you take some kind of treatment, hopefully you're doing something that's based on good biomedical research that says this is an evidence-based treatment. It's not a placebo. We can't afford any climate placebos, and we're trying to make sure you don't stumble across them either. The other thing that's important to know about climate solutions is what do they cost? We've often heard in the past that climate solutions are too expensive. We can't afford to do this. Well, that's actually demonstrably not true. If you look at climate solutions and you look at their net cost, that is, how much does it cost to implement a climate solution compared to business as usual, the world where we keep paying for oil and gas and coal and unsustainable agriculture and polluting industries, those cost money too. And you compare them, a world where we run the world with like renewable energy versus a world where we run it with fossil fuels. Even ignoring the impacts climate change would have on the economy, which would be incalculably large, just looking at the cost of coal versus renewables, it turns out that about 80% of climate solutions are cheaper than the world we have now. That's amazing. So not only do climate solutions work and are scalable and effective, they're actually, most of the time, cheaper than the world we have now. Now, yes, to be fair, about 20% of the climate solutions we look at would be a little bit more expensive than what we do today. And we have to figure that out. Either we subsidize that, like we do the fossil fuels and a lot of other things today, or we have to disrupt those technologies and find cheaper and better ways to do them. But overall, climate solutions are actually pretty cost effective. And so they're here, they're abundant, they work, and they're cheap. So already science has helped us figure out a lot about climate solutions. So you can sort out the what of climate solutions, what works and what does it cost. But now science needs to help us with some other things, especially the how of implementing climate solutions. How do we actually do it? What's the order of operations? Where do we geographically focus? And what other things should we be thinking about as we deploy climate solutions out into the future. Well, a lot of the how boils down to this graph here. And please keep this graph in mind. There's some important lessons here. Basically, the problem of climate change is the red curve. Those are the greenhouse gas emissions we're putting into the atmosphere each and every year. Bottom line of this graph is this is a big number. It's approaching 60 billion tons of CO2 equivalent gases every year. And historically, that number has been inching upward over the last few decades. If that were to continue along the dotted line, we'd take a bad situation and just make it a lot worse. So the biggest part of solving climate change is bending that curve. We're going to bend it fast and bend it very, very hard, especially in the next decade or two. And then we got to keep cutting emissions and keep cutting them all the way through the middle of the century and getting them as close to zero as possible. This is to first and second and third order the job of stopping climate change. Cut the bloody emissions. That's the first job, and then some. But the green curve can be helpful too. This is what we call carbon removal. The idea that in the future, maybe we could use nature and machines to remove some of those greenhouse gases, especially the few that we can't cut so easily. We call those the hard to abate emissions. Things like cement and steel and fertilizer emissions, things that aren't just replaced with a solar panel, for example. Those are going to be hard to cut, we think, by mid-century. So the hope is we could grow up carbon removal to maybe take that last little bit of pollution out of the atmosphere. The problem with carbon removal is it doesn't exist, not at any scale that matters. In fact, if we multiplied the world's carbon removal that exists today by 1,000,000-fold, you still couldn't see it on this graph. We have enormous distance to go before carbon removal is going to make any meaningful difference to the atmosphere. It's tiny, it's expensive, and it's slow. But the hope is by mid-century, maybe we can get it to the gigaton range, to a range that would actually matter to the atmosphere and remove that last little bit of pollution. But don't bet on it. Don't bet the planet. Most of the job is going to be cutting emissions as fast and as hard as we can. Well, when we think about the problem of climate change, another lesson that we have to keep in mind is that climate change is a cumulative property of our planet. What I mean here is that the temperatures we see on Earth this year, which have been shattering records and changing weather in unexpected ways, isn't just because of this year's emissions of greenhouse gases. It's because of the accumulation of greenhouse gases over many, many years, building up in the atmosphere over time. Climate solutions are going to work the same way. It's not what we do in 1 year in 2050 or 2040 or 2030. It's what we do every year all together between now and 2050. So let me show you an example. If we cut emissions drastically in this coming decade, we can prevent that much carbon pollution from going into the atmosphere. And if those emissions cuts are permanent, that we turn off the coal power plants for good, we stop deforestation for good, those emissions cuts accumulate over time and build up over many years, having a total impact that's actually huge. So emissions cuts starting now build up over 3 decades or so into a large cumulative sum. We can take further emissions cuts in the next decade and the decade after that, but the longer we wait, the less time there is for those impacts to accumulate on the atmosphere doing the work of stopping climate change. This is one of the reasons carbon removal is kind of an uphill battle. It starts at basically zero. It's going to take at least a decade or two for it to scale up to any meaningful size. By the time it does, it only has a few years to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and get a total impact that's really large. So when you do this math and you look at the area under the curve, that's what matters to climate change, not the final value of the curve, the area under the curve, the shaded areas. That's the important part with climate change. You find out that emissions cuts are about 96% of what we need to do to stop climate change. And about 76% of that work happens from the first decade of cutting emissions and then accumulating thereafter. So cutting emissions and cutting them now is most of what we have to do to stop climate change. There's no other way around it. Carbon removal gets a lot of attention, but it's never going to be more than just a couple % of the total solution to stop climate change. important, but not the game-changing issue that cutting emissions would be. The other thing that this graph should teach us is a concept that I'd like to call the time value of carbon. We hear about the time value of money quite a lot. That is the idea that if you want to save for something in the future, let's say to retire when you turn 70, you better start saving when you're young. Hopefully in your 20s and 30s, you start saving a little money every year and let it accumulate over time, building up to a large pool of money that later in life you can then live on for a while. So the time value of money is a really important concept that we use every single day. Well, there's also a time value of carbon that says early action matters more because it's a cumulative impact over time. So time value of carbon tells us that when we think about climate change, early actions matter most of all. That's why at Project Drawdown, we talk a lot about looking at climate solutions in kind of waves or as a kind of a portfolio of action over time, not just over sectors. And we talk a lot about what I call emergency brake climate solutions. These are the climate solutions we do now and would have a disproportionately fast impact on climate change, helping us bend the curve really quickly. This would include things like plugging methane leaks, because methane is a very fast and powerful greenhouse gas warming agent in the atmosphere. Methane, as you know, warms the atmosphere a lot, molecule for molecule, especially in the first 10 years after it's emitted. But then after about 10 to 20 years, it kind of fades away. It's a kind of short-lived, hard-punching kind of climate gas. So emergency brakes would limit methane emissions and also black carbon emissions, another powerful, fast-acting part of our climate system. It would also focus a lot on deforestation, because if we don't cut down a rainforest, you instantly get all of that impact of not burning the forest. When you burn a rainforest, let's say in the Amazon, all of that carbon goes up instantly at once. Unlike a coal power plant that does a little bit every year, deforestation is a sudden pulse of pollution. If we can prevent that, that's also an emergency brake. So emergency brakes, methane, black carbon, deforestation, et cetera, these are the things that can give us the biggest bang for the shortest amount of time. I was going to say buck, but the biggest bang in the shortest amount of time. We also, though, have climate solutions that are kind of steady as she goes, changes in infrastructure. Every power plant we turn off and replace with solar and wind will have one more increment of avoided climate change and so on. But then we have solutions that take a little time to kick in, like nature-based solutions, like planting a new forest, restoring soils, regenerative agriculture, all these things we love. But they take decades to build up carbon in trees, in soils, in wetlands. And you have to allow for that kind of time lag and delay before you get the full impact of that climate solution. And then, of course, new technologies, which may take decades to really mature and scale to a meaningful market size, if they do at all. So in climate change, we often talk about the importance of time in picking out climate solutions and really emphasizing the climate solutions that are ready to go now. At Project Drawdown, we also like to say that time is more important than tech, and now is better than new, emphasizing that ready-to-go climate solutions here today are the most important. Another metaphor I might just use here is, if your house is on fire, you just grab the most, the hose that's next to you. You grab a bucket of water, whatever tools are in front of you. You don't sit there and watch the house burn talking about disrupting the fire suppression business, because time is not on your side. Same thing with climate change. Time is the most important variable. So as we think about appropriately using climate solutions with respect to time, we can think about it that way, but we also need to think about how to apply climate solutions geographically. Like, where do we put our climate solutions? Where are the most impactful places in the world to deploy a climate solution? Well, sometimes there are very powerful geographic lessons. For example, if we look at power plants around the world that emit greenhouse gases from burning coal and gas, we see that many of them are very, very dirty. The red power plants in this graph are far dirtier than the yellow ones and the green ones for the same amount of energy production. So those are the ones you want to target first. In fact, about 70% of the electricity emissions in the United States come from about 25% of the power plants in the United States. So let's start with those. Those are the dirtiest polluting power plants. So those are the ones we should take out first and replace with renewables. So there's kind of an 80-20 rule here for climate action, and we should always, always be looking for those. And new advances in technology, including satellite observations and using kind of big data and models and AI to kind of map the world in new powerful ways, also points to where we can pinpoint climate action. In this example, we're using a satellite that can see methane plumes from outer space, targeting, in this case, a refinery in the United States, saying, wow, that refinery is spewing a whole bunch of methane into the atmosphere. It's a super polluting point source. Let's go there and shut that sucker down, or at least clean up the fugitive emissions. And we can see pipelines that are leaking. Come, bring a wrench. Let's fix the leaks. This is a good job for machinists and frankly, plumbers to go fix a lot of these leaks by detecting these large point sources. We can do this even in agriculture and land use, pinpointing regions of the world where deforestation should be avoided at all cost. This map is some work that we did showing the balance between new food production that might come from deforestation versus the carbon that's lost when you tear down the rainforest. The red areas are the places where that trade-off would be worst of all, and those should be avoided. Or looking at how we overuse fertilizers in much of the world, but not everywhere is the same. In this map, it shows in the kind of the brown areas here. These are the places where fertilizer dramatically overused, spewing nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, another powerful greenhouse gas. But the green areas of the world, like the Ukraine, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, some other places in the world, still could use fertilizers without causing pollution. And in fact, they might need them to grow a little more food. So how do we kind of pinpoint our interventions to the most important places and geographically target our solutions to where they'd have the biggest impact? That's crucial. So let's make sure we apply our solutions in time and space where they can be most effective. The other thing we should do with climate solutions is embrace learning curves. It turns out many climate solutions have what's called a learning curve. A learning curve is a simple idea that is the more we do something, the better we get at it. And often things will get cheaper the more we do them. Like, the first iPhone probably cost a couple $1 billion. I don't know, but the next 1,000 were a lot cheaper, and now they cost a few $100s. That's amazing. Learning curves are really, really helpful in driving down the cost of climate solutions, making them more scalable. But time and time again, what we learned from assessing different technologies is that big, centralized, kind of lumpy solutions don't have very good learning curves. They don't get cheaper over time. In fact, sometimes they get even more expensive. Like nuclear power is the only energy source in history that has gotten more expensive the more we build it, not less expensive. Carbon capture doesn't seem to have, but industrial carbon capture like direct air capture and CCS, those are expensive and not coming down in cost yet either. Kind of big centralized billion-dollar facilities with lots of red tape, lots of permitting issues, lots of construction delays, lots of labor issues and regulations and all that tend to be slow and lumpy and not really good learning curves. These don't get cheap fast. But the smaller, modular, kind of granular solutions like batteries, solar panels, LED lighting, electric vehicles, heat pumps, wind turbines, the more we build these, they get cheaper faster like crazy. They have very good learning curves. Solar, for example, is getting cheaper faster than anybody ever predicted. Even the most optimistic scenarios for the price declines of solar are beaten every year because they just are unprecedented cost reductions in solar, which is amazing. So if you're going to be betting on climate solutions to get cheaper and more scalable over time and time again, we find that the more granular the solution, the more we can build them by the millions, the cheaper they get more quickly. And those are probably the horses to bet on. Another aspect of the Drawdown Roadmap that's very important is to look beyond climate and carbon alone, because we're living in a world that has a lot of problems, not just climate change, maybe climate solutions can not only address the climate problem, but maybe they can also have what we call co-benefits that improve human well-being and other things around the planet. Well, the opportunities here are enormous because just think of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are the single biggest contributor to climate change, as you all know. Not the only contributor, but the biggest one by far. It's also one of the biggest sources of local air pollution that you and I breathe right here, right now. Beyond greenhouse gases, fossil fuels also produce soot and particulate matter and ground level smog that we breathe that causes incredible health distress for millions and millions of people around the world every year. In fact, it's estimated that about 9 million people a year die prematurely because of the air quality problems linked to fossil fuels. That's incredible. This is a really good reason to get rid of fossil fuels, maybe even better than addressing climate change. By getting rid of fossil fuels, not only do we get rid of the single biggest source of climate change, we also eliminate the air pollution that causes 9 million premature deaths a year. That's more than the deaths from firearms, warfare, and tobacco combined. It'd be the single biggest jump in human health that we'd see in decades if we phased out fossil fuels. And it would be immediate and local and cost effective. That's incredible. Well, at Drawdown, we've looked for other kind of co-benefits between climate solutions like those on the left and human benefits like those on the right. In this case, we were looking at solutions to climate change that could be used in very low and middle income countries for people living in extreme poverty, living under about $2 a day, for example. Could climate solutions not only address climate change, but also increase food supplies, provide opportunities for income and work and jobs, or improve water and sanitation and health and gender equality and education and so on? Yeah, the more we looked, the more of these opportunities we were finding. So when I look at climate solutions, I often want to look for not only the solutions that are most effective at addressing the climate problem, but the ones that also have incredible benefits to people today. Because these benefits can be immediate, they can be right where you live, and they can be super cost effective and address real problems in the world right now, while also being part of the global solution over the next decades to the global climate crisis. We can do both and find human co-benefits to climate solutions. And finally, one of the things we need to do in this Drawdown Roadmap is make sure we put all the pieces together and put together an effective portfolio of solutions that works well. If we're going to have to do many different things to address climate change, working in electricity and food and transportation and buildings, all these different areas, how do we know how much to do of each? Well, the Drawdown Roadmap can give us a guide here too. This is kind of a simple portfolio that we developed looking at what we need to do to stop climate change by mid-century. Again, I told you before, most of it is cutting emissions, and a little bit of it is removing carbon. But this tells us where. It tells us where we need to cut emissions, that much in electricity, this much in food, this much in industry, transportation, building operations, energy processing, and other things, etc. So this is the work we need to do to stop climate change, expressed as carbon, where we cut emissions and where we remove some carbon from the atmosphere. Well, let's compare the work we need to do in the atmosphere to where we put our time and resources to address climate change. In this case, we're going to look at the money. We're literally following the money here. So this is a case of where we looked at philanthropy, people who donate money to help advance climate solutions. That's estimated to be nowadays about $8 billion a year. It's pretty considerable. It's a nice, good step in addressing climate change is starting here. And then we looked at kind of where that money seems to be allocated, at least as it's reported by self-reporting. They may not be 100% accurate, and there are questions of interpreting those decisions, but here's a general guide of where philanthropy seems to be going. And then we looked at private capital, in this case, venture capital, VC money, where this is often to help spur new technologies, climate tech, as you often hear. This is a much bigger number, about 10 times bigger than philanthropy. It's about 80 to 90 billion a year. Interestingly, in 2021, the last year we looked at this, most of the money in venture capital went into one technology. electric cars and electric scooters. That took up 66% of all the climate tech money went into batteries and wheels, basically. But the science tells us that vehicles emit about 5 to 10% of the world's emissions could be abated with electric vehicles. So what is maybe a 5 to 10% solution? Got over 2/3 of all the money in climate tech. That's misaligning, I think, capital to carbon. And then we can look at government funding. Here's a snapshot of the Inflation Reduction Act, one, not the only, kind of government source of funding for climate solutions in the United States in this case. The IRA, as we call it, is spending about 35 to 40 billion a year on climate tech kind of solutions, most of them focusing right now on electricity. That might seem a little weird. Why are we spending so much on electricity when it's not the only problem we have? But electricity might be the gateway to unlocking solutions in other areas, especially transportation and buildings where electric vehicles and heat pumps and things like that become really powerful. So by greening the grid and getting green electricity now, it makes it easier to have good solutions in buildings and transportation and industry later on. So this may not be as out of whack as it might seem at first. But at the end of the day, we have to kind of look at the resources and time and all the things we put into climate solutions, money, people, time, and effort, and compare that to what the science is telling us the atmosphere needs. Are we aligning our resources, like capital, with the carbon that we actually need to address? And unfortunately, most of the time, the answer right now is no, we're not. We're following fads, we're following money, we're following politics more than we're following the science. But the science needs to be there too and gently nudge us to keep reminding us what the work is so we align our work with the carbon in the atmosphere. So the Drawdown Roadmap sets out kind of pillars of climate action. It reminds us that what we do should be based in strong scientific evidence, that we should look at solutions that are cost effective, ideally that are cheap and maybe save us money compared to the world we already have. We should definitely be emphasizing the solutions that are ready to go now so they can start accumulating impact today and into the next few decades, accumulating a much bigger impact than the solutions that will wait a decade or two or three before they kick in. We also have opportunities to use big data and new tools to geographically target our climate solutions to the most impactful places and address climate change in very powerful ways. That we should also bet on solutions that are more granular, that tend to get more cost effective and just better more quickly than lumpy solutions where we only build one or two at a time. We also should definitely strive for climate solutions that have other benefits, especially to vulnerable people, addressing concerns around health, the economy, security, and equity worldwide. And finally, to make sure that everything we do is aligned at the end of the day with what the atmosphere demands that we do, which is to cut emissions dramatically across 6 big sectors and remove some carbon by mid-century. If we do all that, we still have a narrow window of opportunity to address climate change. It is not too late, but just barely. We have largely squandered the last 3 decades of climate action. We didn't do enough. We didn't listen to the scientists early enough. We didn't have the political will. We didn't deploy resources. We didn't do enough in the past. If we had started in a more serious way 20 or 30 years ago, this would have been relatively easy, but we didn't. So now we just have a tiny, narrow window of opportunity to avoid the worst parts of climate change. But I believe we can still pull it off. The only way we will, though, is if we follow science very carefully. If we use every single day perfectly, if we deploy every dollar perfectly, if we pay attention to every single step along the way and execute flawlessly, then we have to stick the landing every single time now. We can still pull it off. But that's the only way we will now. We have no more time to waste. We have no more money to waste. We have no more time to squander anything. But if we do pay attention to the science, we can pull it off. And as I said before, build an incredible world in the process. A world where we not only address climate change and avoid a bad problem, we actually ended up making the rest of the world a whole lot better in the process. A world that is cleaner, that has better health, better security, more jobs, more prosperity, and more equity and justice for the whole world and for our future. And I believe we can do this. I think we can find our way there if we follow the science and really double down and accelerate our efforts. At Drawdown, we often like to remind people that, it is not game over on climate change, but we do need to step it up. It is game on time. So with that, I will stop here and stop the little presentation and hand it to Ted to see if we have some conversation and some questions, and love to hear from you and hear from your questions and have a conversation here. So thank you very, very much. Appreciate your attention. So Ted, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Ted from the Drawdown Labs team here. And John, just want to thank you first and foremost for the informative and, might I say, inspiring presentation. It's always good to have that Drawdown Roadmap just unpacked a little bit more. So thank you for that. We have had some questions come in. So we're going to do our best to answer as many of them as possible with the remaining time that we have. Folks, if you have questions for John, feel free to keep dropping them in there, and we'll hop right into it to cover as much ground as possible.
Great.
And one of the first questions that we got was around emergency brake solutions. The question is, what are the most effective emergency brake solutions that foundations can fund? And is there anyone currently vetting the outcomes of any of these organizations?
Absolutely. In fact, some of our future sessions, including what we call deep dives, are going to focus on some of these emergency brake areas. What I find very exciting now is that there's been a real spotlight shining on a couple of key areas of these so-called emergency brakes. One I would point attention to is methane. Methane has caused about a third of the warming we have seen so far, but it hasn't gotten a third of the attention at all. Almost all the attention goes to carbon dioxide, which will dominate warming hundreds of years into the future, of course. But in the near term, when you and I are alive and our children are alive, methane's about a third of what's causing climate change in real time today. So that's an area where we could have a little bit of kind of disproportionate impact for some pretty quick wins right now. So addressing methane, where does methane come from? Two big areas, the energy industry and agriculture, essentially. In the energy industry, it's two things: flaring of natural gas during oil and gas production. We could avoid some of that and regulate that better. And now we can see it from outer space and find the polluters and make them stop. The other is what we call fugitive emissions, the unintended emissions from abandoned coal mines, abandoned oil wells, abandoned gas wells, pipelines that are leaky, even into our homes and in our municipal districts of natural gas distribution and pipeline. It's not only a climate issue, by the way, it's a safety issue. You don't want leaking natural gas. It explodes, it's bad. And it's also an air pollution issue. So plugging methane leaks in the energy world is a no-brainer. And finally, the Biden administration is beginning to impose regulations on this through the EPA. We're getting new tools to pinpoint at least the large single source emissions from space and put that out into the public domain in real time. And I'm really excited. There's a group called the Global Methane Hub, which is where a number of philanthropists have put considerable resources into a global coordinated effort to fund work on methane pollution. Full disclosure, Project Drawdown is one of the recipients of a grant from the Global Methane Hub, so we have a connection to them. And they fund a little bit of our work. But even if they didn't, I would still think they're really worth paying attention to. So check out the Global Methane Hub. And it was a combination of many large foundations, foundations big and small, that coordinated their work to fund a Global Methane Hub. And it's a really, really fantastic resource. Check them out. The other side of the methane street, a little bit more than half, comes from agriculture and the larger food system, primarily from cattle or ruminant animals, not just cows and cattle, but also sheep and goats and lots of little critters that belch methane. Well, they do that because they're digesting stuff that their stomachs digest in 4 little chambers with rumen, and that produces methane. Very, very hard to avoid. So what are the solutions to that? Well, having fewer of the animals in the first place is a big, good head start. Reducing food waste, shifting diets, that would help enormously. But there's also a lot of excitement around kind of regenerative agriculture, where the methane still gets emitted into the atmosphere, but maybe we could offset that somewhat by putting more carbon back into the soil as kind of a carbon offset to the methane emissions. There's a lot of debate about how effective that'll be, but it's definitely a tool worth looking at. But also feed additives, other things like this. But another big source of methane is from organic matter like food and other waste that we dump into landfills. So when we dump organic stuff into an anaerobic, oxygen-free environment, it produces methane. So avoiding organic material, especially food waste and other things, going into landfills, even into wastewater, is also a methane solution. So there are lots of practical methane solutions out there that would have a really immediate impact on the atmosphere, and we're finally beginning to pay attention to some of those. That's exciting. The other is a thing called, or the other area I would focus a lot of attention on is deforestation. When you prevent deforestation, you prevent an immediate pulse of carbon going into the atmosphere. If you didn't tear down the rainforest and burn it down, the carbon just stays there 100%. It's an instant, all in one day solution to climate change. It never burned in the first place. That's fantastic. And deforestation's huge. Right now, deforestation emits about 11% of the world's greenhouse gases. That's more than the United States economy emits. So the world's biggest emitters are China, deforestation, the United States, Europe. But we never talk about deforestation. It's bigger than the US economy, just crossed over that about a year or two ago. That's insane. It's also the single biggest driver of biodiversity loss in the world. It's a big contributor to air quality problems in the tropics where people live near this burning forest. That's terrible. It's also a place where we could unleash vector-borne new threats and diseases into the world. A lot of the diseases that entered the human population in the last 50 years came from animals in rainforest. And so keeping forest intact, I think, is the #1 environmental problem facing the world, not only for climate, but for biodiversity and many other reasons. So deforestation is huge, but we don't talk about that enough either. But thankfully, a number of big foundations are beginning to marshal their efforts together. And there's a very exciting new initiative that we're going to talk more about in several weeks called Forest People Climate. If you go to the words forestpeopleclimate.org, you'll see a very exciting new philanthropic initiative that's aiming to marshal, I believe, $2 billion to protect the world's rainforest. They've received a few signature gifts from, I believe, the Ballmer Family Foundation, Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft. I believe they gave $200 million to get that started. And I think a few people on this call are also contributors to this exciting new initiative that was launched by CLUA, the Climate and Land Use Alliance, which included a lot of leadership from the Packard Foundation, MacArthur, Ford, Moore Foundation, and many other really great philanthropic entities. So I could go on and on, probably too much. But for those of you who are thinking about philanthropy, methane and forest are beginning to galvanize some very, very interesting attention. And we're going to work with you all, I hope, this year to bring additional philanthropic resources to bear on these critical emergency brake solutions. Others I would look at too are what we talk about as black carbon or soot. It's not a gas, but it still warms the atmosphere, and it's still something because of we burning things in bad ways. And Drawdown has written numerous reports on black carbon and what we call clean cooking, especially in tropical countries that could be a very important in climate, but also air quality and health solution. So check those out too. I'd like to see some philanthropy focusing more and more attention on the black carbon problem. That's also an emergency brake solution.
Thanks, John. There's a couple questions coming in, just kind of still on the theme of emergency brake solutions. So I'm going to stick with that for a minute here. One question in particular around how business leaders who are committed to climate action might think about these emergency brake solutions in the context of their own net zero targets or decarbonization plans. There's also a question from Dana around recommendations for good companies or organizations kind of doing that work. And I maybe will just plug again, those deep dives are a forum where we are going to be convening members of our corporate community, as well as the investor and philanthropic communities, and kind of showcasing some of the good work that's happening. So I'll give another plug to those convenings as a forum to kind of hold up examples of good case studies and things of that nature. But curious, John, if you can unpack a little bit what emergency brake solutions might look like in the context of corporate decarbonization plans.
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing I might step back from the emergency brakes a wee bit and just remind people again that it's the cumulative actions every year added together that actually the atmosphere notices, not just one year in particular. So sometimes companies will set a target, like we will be, net zero by 2050. And maybe there's some intermediate goals. In 2030, we'll cut emissions by this much, and in 2040 by that much. And that all makes sense to, right? But the atmosphere doesn't look at just a snapshot of one year. It looks at every year, all the emissions, every gram of carbon you emit from today till the end of time matters. So every gram you avoid matters from today onward. So I'd love to see corporate goals looking at the cumulative actions of their climate plans, not just a snapshot in time. I was recently visiting a company that had very good goals, but they were benchmarked to 2030. And I kind of noticed you're putting off a lot of hard decisions until 2029 because you just don't want to do that, but you were going to get your goal. Like the atmosphere doesn't work like that. That may be how your company works, but the atmosphere cares about what you do every year, not just the years you declared your benchmarks. The atmosphere doesn't know what year it is. Only you do. All it knows is how much carbon you put up there. So I'd love to see corporations and everybody kind of look at your cumulative emissions between now and a benchmark year, not just the slice of one year alone, because that's not science. That's just project management stuff, whatever. It's good, but we could do better. When you do that, then you find that, wow, by taking early action that accumulates or that is faster action than normal, you have a bigger impact. And that's why, like methane, if you take the math into account correctly, gives you such a big win. If methane's part of your emissions portfolio, really hit that hard now. Or if deforestation is a big part of your supply chain and you really do the math on that correctly, anytime you avoid deforestation, it's a huge impact compared to a little bit of impact every year for the next 30 years, because it all happens up all at once. The impact of avoided deforestation is front-loaded to this year, not years into the future. And it just stays that way forever. So again, the math works in your favor to work on methane and deforestation, soot and black carbon now, as well as other things that you can have early wins that keep on adding up every year, like reducing food waste. That's a big one I like a lot. Energy efficiency. You don't need to wait for new infrastructure, new technology. Let's kind of get those early wins and keep counting them every year from now on. And that's where I think, some of the corporate plans could be better sometimes and celebrate the great work that is going on and get full credit for it by, again, accumulating that time value of carbon in your math, not just 1 year here and 1 year in the next decade. That would help a lot. And I don't want to name specific companies so much, but I think there are some really great leaders in this who are taking things seriously. All over, it's all grading on a curve here. But maybe not point out specific companies, but I think we need to look at, not only the energy and manufacturing sectors, but we're going to have quite a bit of focus on the food sector later this year at Project Drawdown, so I might highlight that a little bit. I think people are surprised to learn that food and agriculture causes about 25% of greenhouse gases on Earth today directly. And if you look at the larger food system, including food waste and processing, transporting, refrigerating, and cooking food, it grows to over about, between 30 and 35%. It's second only to fossil fuels. It's, a quarter to a third of the climate problem is tied up in food, folks. And I don't think that's gotten a quarter to a third of our attention yet. So we definitely need to be thinking a lot harder about food and a much more complete toolbox, not just the regenerative ag carbon offsets, but a full set of solutions to food, including avoiding deforestation, changing diets, changing food waste, getting rid of biofuels that use crops, things like that that are kind of problematic, managing fertilizers better, and also kind of making sure we address methane, N2O, and carbon at the source. And we do things like building up soil carbon and restoring vegetation as well. But we have to cut those primary emissions as well as removing some carbon with nature helping us. We need to do both of those things. And a more complete toolbox for solutions in the food and ag sector is critical. And a lot of the emergency brakes happen to be in that food area, deforestation, and over half the methane.
Thanks, Sean. I think we have time for one more question, and we have one from our friend Kevin. around offsets. And Kevin notes that it seems that every industry is now offering some form of offset for their carbon pollution. It's an incredibly confusing space. And Kevin's heard that there are that offsets can help build a market to scale climate solutions, but on the flip side, they can be unregulated and unreliable. And so his question is, how can we become savvier on offsets? And is there a recommended sort of source of truth that you have to help navigate that space?
Wow, that's a really complicated. Well, it's actually not that complicated space, but it became complicated because there's a lot of hand waving going on here. But yeah, I agree with Kevin completely. The idea of a carbon offsets market is a good idea. If people are willing to pay the world to cut emissions someplace or to absorb carbon someplace, and there's more money going out into the world doing good stuff, that's not a bad day. Like I'm in favor of that. Hey, it's more money, a lot of it, to go have the world cut emissions or remove carbon. That's pretty cool. The problem is the markets were unregulated. There was a lot of shady stuff going on, a lot of double counting, a lot of poor kind of monitoring, verification, and additionality kind of issues. Was it really, did the money actually prevent emissions from going in the atmosphere, or would that have happened anyway? Was it what we call additional? Is it measurable? Like how much did it really do what it's supposed to do? Is it truly verifiable? And of course, is it permanent? Like, planting trees might absorb some of the carbon that we emitted someplace else, but then what if the trees burn down? What if somebody cuts them down? Or like regenerative agriculture. Oh, hey, that farm's absorbing some carbon today, but what about the next farmer? And what if they plow it all up again and vaporize all that carbon in just 1 year? That could happen like that. And 40% of the U.S. cropland is leased on a couple-year lease at a time. How is that going to be permanent? So there are a lot of real questions around here. So there's, how do we make sure emissions are truly additional? They're truly measurable, verifiable, and permanent. All of those things are completely good questions. I think real high integrity carbon offsets are going to cost a lot more than what people were paying before. They were too cheap, but also there's a reason why they were too cheap for a long time. But there are some carbon offsets that I think do make sense, as long as you're also really cutting your emissions too. It isn't meant to be a free pass to keep polluting. But if you're doing everything you can to cut your own emissions and you willingly want to pay a little bit more to maybe, help the world cut some other emissions too, call that philanthropy. Don't call it an offset. Just cut your own emissions as far as you can. You're not going to get to zero right away. That's okay. And then maybe you want to help the world cut emissions elsewhere. Great, do it. The world could use the money. But think of it more like a philanthropic exercise than an accounting trick to make it look like you didn't emit something when you actually did. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement in this, but the idea of more money going to good climate solutions, that's great. And cleaning up the carbon markets is necessary, but right now it's a bit of the Wild West, and we need to do better. And there's been a lot of well, let me just say this. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I like the idea of a market mechanism that puts money into good solutions. So let's make sure they're good and not kind of shady stuff. And also, we have to have better rules about conflicts of interest. When companies are hiring people to verify their offsets and things like this, make sure they're truly independent, like you would a financial auditing firm. Make sure that the people kind of policing carbon offsets are truly financially independent of the people who are being audited for this. I think we need a much cleaner rules of the road and avoided conflicts of interest and better ethics for the whole system. And there's some kind of troubling issues here, but it can be better. It can be better.
Thank you again for joining us today. A huge thank you to all of our supporters, many of whom you see up here on your screen, as well as our extended network of business and capital coalition members and partners. We are so appreciative of all your support and collaboration, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Drawdown briefing. Thank you.